Amen. Amen. Well, we've got 4 weeks left in the year after today. December happens to be a 5 Sunday month. We've got 4 weeks left in this year. And we are on a course as the Lord is preparing us as a spiritual family to move into a different space. And I shared with you last week, and I pray that if you didn't get to hear the message from last week, The State of War, I pray that you would listen to that, watch it on the app. But that was really the precursor for where the Lord is bringing us and what he's going to be doing through us. Today, we need to begin just to touch on the details about where the Lord is bringing us. And I want to start with something that we need to be attentive to when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus in his ministry did 3 main things that we need to be attentive to. Number 1, he ministered to sinners. Number 2, he taught his disciples. And number 3, he challenged the current theological perspective of the religious leaders of his day. And the thing with all 3 of those is that we have a tendency as we read the scriptures to focus on 2, but not the 3rd. And the challenge for us is that in the midst of that, while we ignore one of those focuses, it tends to have a strange effect on our growth trajectory as Christians, that we come into our relationship and our spiritual walk with Jesus as sinners saved by grace. We tend to skip over being disciples and jump right into being religious. And that has some very dangerous implications, and I'm going to share that in a second. But the reason why we do it is because as we read the scriptures, as Jesus is challenging the theological perspective of the religious leaders of his day, we tend to purposely not relate to them because we see that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, and the elders were opposed to Jesus, and we don't want to see ourselves aligned with those who are opposed to Jesus. So when we read the Gospels, we tend to look at them and look right past them and just automatically dismiss them and say, but that ain't us. But the challenge is sometimes it is us. Sometimes what we see in them is us. There are some circumstances and there are some situations and there are some times where what Jesus is rebuking in them, while we're reading, he's trying to rebuke in us. And one of the things that he's trying to do in his example and challenge to their theological perspective is he's trying to break them apart. He's trying to separate them from religion. He's trying to separate them from religion. Because the reality is the greatest danger of religion is the tendency to hold on to things that have died when we need to let go of them so that we can thrive. Yeah. That's right. Religion carries with it a danger of the tendency of holding on to things that have died, specifically in seasons when we need to let them go so that we can thrive. Yeah. And this is one of the things that Jesus is challenging the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and the elders and even the disciples of John with in his time. So I want to get into this text because this text shows us Jesus' ministry on all 3 of those levels. And we need to look at some truths that are found in this text. Luke chapter 5, I'm going to begin reading at verse number 33. Verse number 33 in chapter 5 of Luke says this: They said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. Jesus answered, Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast. He told them this parable: No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch it on an old. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No new wine must be poured into new wineskins, and no one after drinking the old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. Oh, Jesus. Jesus, the old is better. I want to just set some background for this. This occurs in chapter 5, where Jesus has just asked a tax collector by the name of Levi, who many of you know as Matthew, the disciple. Jesus has asked this tax collector to come and follow him. So Jesus is walking along, sees a tax collector at work, at his booth, and just says these words, "Come follow me." The tax collector shuts down his business, picks up, and follows Jesus. Oh. Now, see, the challenge for us when it comes to the scriptures is that we're reading things that happen in a context that is not all spoken of right there. And one of the things I want you to understand, particularly as you're saying to yourself, why would a man just shut down his business and follow some guy who said, follow me? Well, understand that Jesus had already been working in his ministry. Number one, Jesus has already cast out some demons. He's already healed some sick folks. He's already been preaching in synagogues. And now people in the region of Galilee and Judea know who he is. So undoubtedly, as Levi is sitting at his booth and Jesus walks by and says, follow me, Levi knows who he is. He's heard about him, and Levi is thinking, wow, this guy who's been healing the sick, casting out demons, preaching in the synagogues, he wants me to follow him. See, now, that's a different context. There's many of you, had that situation been happening to you, you would have shut your booth down, and you would have followed too. So he shuts his business down, and he literally follows Jesus. But when he does that, he says, Jesus, listen, can I do something for you? Can I throw a party at my house with a big feast? And can I invite all my friends? And Jesus says, of course you can. I'll be there. So Levi, Matthew, goes home, he prepares a banquet. The scriptures say a banquet. We're not used to banquets unless you go to the Golden Corral, and I'm skeptical. Anyway, I'm sorry. I got this new thing where if food is mass produced, I'm concerned about quality. Yeah. Anyway, hallelujah. But they didn't have Golden Corral. Levi has got real food all set up. A banquet, and he invites other tax collectors and friends he has. And you have to understand how Jews view tax collectors, because tax collectors were known at that time for padding a little bit of the tax. So if the tax was actually 100 denarii, they would go to people and say, hey, you know what, the tax today is 130 denarii. And they would take 30 for themselves and send the 100 to Rome. And so tax collectors were known for living this lifestyle, and many of them had money. I mean, this is why Matthew was throwing the banquet in the first place, because he's been padding the tax. He's got the money for the banquet. But the Jews view them on the same level that they view thieves and murderers, because they know that this is their reputation, that they're literally stealing from their own people, that they're taking money from the Jews, not only for the Romans, but padding extra for themselves. Isn't it interesting that Jesus would choose a man like this to say, follow me? Oh. Later on, there are some of you in this room this morning who maybe if you don't know Jesus, later on you're going to hear me give an invitation. And I want you to recognize something. I want you to think about Levi. Think about Matthew. Think about the person he was. Because oftentimes, many of us, there are people who won't come to the gospel, even though the Spirit of God is moving in their heart and urging them, because they're thinking about the condition of their lives. But Jesus calls Matthew while he's sitting in his booth. Yeah. Matthew, who most people know, is taking a little something off the top. And Jesus didn't qualify him first. He didn't qualify him first. He just said, follow me. And so Levi follows, and he throws this banquet. And man, I'm telling you, Levi is onto something that many of us are not. Levi is evangelizing day one. Levi throws a party because he's like, look, I want you to come meet the Jesus who I'm leaving everything for, to follow. Come to my house. I got food. I got wine. Come on over and meet this Jesus who I'm giving up everything for. Can you imagine? What if people did that today? You guys have heard about coming out parties. What if you had a coming in party? I'm coming into the kingdom. Why don't y'all come over to my house? I got some collard greens. I got some Pinot Grigio. Come let me tell you about how I'm following this Jesus. Oh, I said Pinot Grigio. I lost some of y'all. Jesus. Oh, help me, Jesus. Oh, what did I do? All right. Some of y'all are like, I'm with you, Pastor. But this is what Levi does. This is what Levi does. And at this party, there are other people who got an invitation. Some of them are Pharisees, and some of them are John's disciples. So the Pharisees, they ease their way into the party. And don't you know that when they ease themselves in, they seek out Jesus' disciples. Now, this is interesting. Rather than going to inquire anything of Jesus, because Jesus was not like a superstar, you couldn't not walk up and have a conversation. So they don't go to Jesus, but they go to his disciples. And I believe that they do this to try to stir some division. Yes. And they go to his disciples and they say, hey, you know, how come you guys are eating with sinners and tax collectors? What's up with that? This is what you do? Can you imagine, like, they're at the party, like, in the background? Psst. Psst. Why y'all eating with sinners and tax collectors? Right? You know some people like that. Yes. But Jesus, the disciples don't get a chance to respond because one of the amazing things about Jesus, we see this throughout the Gospels. Oh, how I wish that of all the ways that Jesus has and all the things that we might do like Jesus, I wish I could do this. Jesus can read people's minds. He can read people's thoughts. He may not have even been able to hear it, but he knows what they're saying, so he stops them. And he says to them, listen. He says, healthy people don't need a doctor. He says, I've come to call the sinner to repentance, not the righteous. And so Jesus, in that phrase, shuts the Pharisees and the scribes down. But the problem is that the Pharisees and the scribes are not the only people there who have a problem with Jesus. They're not the only people who were there who are a little bit jealous. See, one of the problems that people had with Jesus is that there were different groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and John's disciples who had some influence. And as Jesus came on the scene, he began to turn over the order of influence, and he began to gain a great deal of influence for himself. Yeah. And there were a number of people who had influence, who had problems with the fact that Jesus was stealing people from them. John's disciples were amongst that group. If you remember, there's a point in the scriptures where John's disciples go to John and they go, do you know that guy you told us about, that you baptized the other day? Him and his people are baptizing more people than us. Yeah. Yeah. So they're at the party, and this is when they come in because they heard Jesus' response to the Pharisees and how he shut them down. So these guys, rather than asking questions to the disciples, they decide we'll address Jesus ourselves. And then they are the ones who ask this question. I know that in Luke, you don't see it, but Matthew, whose party it is, he records it in his gospel, and he lets us know that the people who are asking these questions are actually John's disciples. So John's disciples in verse 33 say, John's disciples, and of course in Matthew it says, they just said, we often fast. But John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. Now, what they're actually trying to suggest is that the ascetic life, or the ascetic life that they live, is somehow more orthodox, more traditional, more in the way of what religion always looked like. For those of you who don't know the word ascetic is like when you do this extreme self-denial. So you notice that John the Baptist, he didn't live in a regular house and he didn't eat regular food. He lived an ascetic lifestyle. These guys, John's disciples and the Pharisees, they also lived ascetic lifestyles. In fact, they would fast twice a week. And it just so happens that they fasted on Mondays and Thursdays, and also just so happens that this party was on one of those days. And so they're trying to say that this ascetic lifestyle that they live is more in line with what real religious people live. And they're asking Jesus, how come you're not living this? And so the challenge, as Jesus answers this, is that they're challenging Jesus' methods with the religious practices of the day. And so Jesus answers and says this: can you make the friends of a bridegroom fast while he's with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and in those days they will fast. In today's terms, let me tell you what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, look, if a guy were getting married the night before his wedding and the day of his wedding, would all of his friends be looking sad for the sake of appearing religious? That doesn't make sense. What Jesus is saying here is he's saying, look, we're not about to do things to live some kind of ascetic lifestyle, to have an appearance of religion that just aren't even natural to do. It's not natural to pretend like you're mourning when in fact you really feel joy.
Right.
Not for religious sake. That's the challenge. And I got to tell you, you've seen this. There are religious groups, for instance, that have doctrine that say things like, well, priests can't get married. And that degree of asceticism is unnatural. Oh. Yeah. When God created Adam, he said it's not good for man to be alone. And then he created Eve. Don't you remember that when Paul, who refers to his ability to not be moved by anybody and to not be married, he considers that a gift. Thus meaning we all don't have that.
You're right.
So when doctrine demands that you are not marry, you're ascribing to something that's not natural. You're trying to reach this kind of ascetic level where you're denying what is natural to your life, to your body. Keep in mind, I say this when I do premarital counseling. When the urges that we have physically, those urges, the devil had no say in the put together of your body. God designed it all. So the urges you have, those are designed for you to have by God. So to deny those things, that's unnatural. And what Jesus is saying to these people, John's disciples, he's saying, look, I understand that you guys fast Mondays and Tuesdays, or Mondays and Thursdays. I get you, and that's fine for you. He says, but right now, my disciples are with me, and I am with them, and while I'm with them, we have joy together. Yeah. And I'm not going to ask them to pretend like they're mourning while I'm still here and we have joy. Yeah. There will come a time when I'll be gone, then they can mourn. But as for now, we have joy together. Yeah. And we're not about to change it for the appearance of religion.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
But he's also teaching another lesson. Because the other thing is this: Jesus knew what day of the week he accepted this invitation. He knew when he accepted the invitation that there was going to be food and drink, and he accepted the invitation anyway. Because in reality, what Jesus is also saying through his actions rather than his words is that I am prioritizing God's work, Amen. The salvation of lost souls, over the traditions of men. Yeah. Because you do realize that this whole fasting on Mondays and Thursdays, that was not God's command. Can you imagine? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, John's disciples, they're getting their panties all up in a bunch. Because the days that they decided to fast, Jesus is not fasting and his disciples are not fasting. It had nothing to do with God. But what Jesus is doing is all about God. See, Jesus accepted this invitation to eat because he figured that if he could just sit with these people, that if he could sit with Matthew's friends, other tax collectors and sinners, that if he could sit with them, then maybe he could save them. Yeah. That if he could share a meal with them, then he could save them. And this was more important than appearing religious. Oh, see, y'all didn't get me. The salvation of souls was more important than the appearance of religion. Do you realize that as Christians, sometimes we tend to have a Pharisaical perspective rather than a Christological perspective? And here's what I mean. The Pharisees viewed the kingdom as a club that you keep sinners out of. Jesus views the kingdom as a club that you pull sinners into.
That's right.
Yes.
And this is the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach these men. Then we get down to verse 36. He says this. He told them this parable. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch it on an old one. Otherwise, they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. So I just want you to think about this from our day and time perspective, right? If you have an old pair of jeans that you love, and many people have an old pair of jeans that they love, right? If you have an old pair of jeans that you love, and that pair of jeans just happens to get a hole, and I should say in today's world, a hole where the hole shouldn't be. Because I know people are wearing holes everywhere, right? But if you happen to get a hole in a place where the hole shouldn't be, you don't go and buy a brand new pair of pants, cut a piece out of the brand new pair of pants to sew it onto your old pants. And you don't do it for two reasons. Number one, to buy a brand new pair of pants and cut them up seems ridiculous. Yeah. Who's gonna spend money only to cut a piece of it off? Now the whole pant is no good, and all you got is a piece that you're about to try to sew on to some old jeans. The second problem, of course, is that the new patch is not going to match the old jeans. Yeah. The old jeans are worn, they've been washed, they start to fade. The new patch is all new. It would look crazy. But more than that, the new patch hasn't even shrunk yet. So if you sewed it on the old jeans, throw it in the washing machine, when you pull it out, it's gonna pull away from the old jeans. And the old jeans are gonna be worse. This is what Jesus is saying. See, he's helping the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief elders and the scribes and John's disciples to recognize, I can't take this new covenant and attach it to your old covenant. They won't match. They won't match. See, the old covenant is based on the law. It requires that the person who's putting their faith in the law live it all. And the closer someone gets to it, the more prideful they become. And this was the challenge with the Pharisees. And Jesus is saying, look, I can't take the ways of the new covenant and try to patch it on to this old covenant, because the new covenant is based on grace. And the only requirement it has is that you're humble enough to recognize you need that grace. It's the only requirement. So Jesus is saying, see, I can't take this covenant of grace and try to fit it onto your covenant of law. They won't fit, they won't match, and the covenant of law will ultimately be destroyed, and the covenant of grace would look crazy and run all over the floor. Can't match them. And what Jesus realized in those moments, as he said this, he knew that all the people who were listening, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief elders, the scribes, John's disciples, that they wouldn't understand. And so to try to push them along, Jesus did something that you guys refer to as trying to be slick. Look at, Jesus is no joke. He says this next. And no one who pours new wine into old wineskins, or no one pours new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins, and here's the slick part. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, because they say the old is better. Now, I don't know if you understand the whole thing with the wineskins, but they used to put wine in actual leather skins. That's where the wine would ferment. The thing is, though, is that during the fermentation process, there are gases that are created, and those gases build up inside the skin and cause the leather skin to bloat and expand. So if you take a wineskin that's already been bloated and expanded and pour new wine into it, then it's going to continue to bloat and expand beyond its capacity as the new wine ferments. And then the wine skin would burst open. And so Jesus is saying that nobody does that. We can't do that with this covenant of grace and your covenant of the law. But then he says this, when he had that last line, but he says this, but even if you understood what I'm saying, you wouldn't do it anyway because you love your old stuff too much. Yeah. You're so in love with the old ways that even if you understood what I was saying, you Couldn't do it. You're in love with the old. And the old is keeping you from what's new.
Wow. That's good. That's real good. Wow.
Your love of what's old is keeping you from experiencing what's new.
Jesus.
Do you know December 31st, we'll be here together for Wash Night service as we do every year. Amen. Our spiritual family will gather in this place and we will worship and bring in the new year together. But I don't know if you've thought about this at all. Do you realize that December 31st, 2019 is not just the beginning of a new year, but it's the beginning of a new decade.
Right. Amen.
It marks the beginning of a new decade. Wow. So 2020, not just the beginning of a new year for us, but it's the beginning of a new decade. Because I'm looking at it, I realize that we can't bring our old church into a new decade.
That's right. Yep.
We can't bring the church that we've been for the past 10 years into the next 10 years.
That's right.
Do you understand what I'm saying? In fact, I want to show you this. In the year 2000, the phrase or the word app was not regularly used. In the year 2000, the word app was not regularly used. But in 2009, Apple filed a trademark for the term, there's an app for that. In the year 2000, this phone right here was hot. Y'all remember that? Y'all remember that? Nokia 5190, if you had one, raise your hand. Oh, Lord, look, half the church. In the year 2000, that phone was hot. I had one. We all had one, right? Right. Jeff was like, yeah, you can change the color of the case. Yeah. He remembers. Some of these millennials are looking at that like, what is that? So in the year 2000, that phone was hot. But in the year 2009, this phone was hot. Oh. What a difference a decade makes. Look, in 2019, nobody has a Nokia. Not Nokia 5190. But beloved, do you realize that there are churches that die because they're trying to hold on to their Nokias in an iPhone age? Do you see what I'm saying? They're trying to press buttons in an iPhone age. The rest of us are flipping. And these churches are pressing buttons. See,
Wow. Come on now.
I don't want to be a church that dies because it's trying to hold on to its Nokia technology because it thinks the old is better than the new. See, I don't want to be that church. So that means, beloved, that we've got to think about where we're going and what needs to be done as a church. See, as we prepare to go into a new decade, not just a year, I don't want to be a new church for 2020. We're going to be a new church for the 2020s.
That's right. That's right.
We need to set a foundation now for the decade to come.
Yes.
Now, the challenge is with newness is that newness costs.
That's right.
You're right.
That's right.
And newness costs getting away from the old. You've got to be willing to give up the old. See, the challenge with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests and the elders and even John's disciples is that what they had always known for so long, they held on to that. That it was even difficult to see a vision for what was new. Beloved, think about this. God said through the prophet Ezekiel that he was going to bring a new covenant. A covenant where he was going to remove hearts of stone. Where he would give hearts of flesh. Where he would put a new spirit and he said he would put his own spirit in us. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the religious leaders of the time, they couldn't see it. Jesus came as the entrance and the door to that new covenant, and they couldn't see it, and they couldn't see it because they loved the old so much. They thought the old was better anyway. And so what Jesus ushered in, many of those men were never able to experience. So I want you to think about this. There is a vision that we have as a church for what our church looks like beginning in 2020. And what we actually plan to do is turn our current church into a launch team. Oh, Jesus. Jesus. We're going to turn our current church into a launch team for the new ministry of the decade.
Amen.
But it requires change, and it requires some newness, and that newness is going to cost the old stuff. Oh, Jesus. Oh. Now, some of y'all are like, Pastor Ron, I'm with you. And some of y'all are like, Pastor Ron, I'm a little nervous. Over these next 4 weeks, beloved, I'm going to lay out for you the plan that the Lord has given us. And I'm going to talk to you about the various details of that plan. But first, we had to set the groundwork. We had to set a foundation. Last week, we talked about the fact that we know that the enemy is at work. He does not sleep, that he is attempting to attack people in our church from the head on down, that we have seen him trying to move in our midst, and that our position is not a position to take the armor of God and to sit and to cower and to hide as he hits and punches and does his blows and pray that God just cause him to go away. No. The scriptures say resist the devil and he will flee. Resist means that if he's swinging, I'm swinging. If he's shooting, I'm shooting. It means that I'm not going to just sit back and allow him to do whatever he wants to do. That's the beginning of it for us, that we can't just let him do whatever he wants to do. But also we recognize in the text that we looked at last week that a part of our getting back is the fact that if he's trying to take from us, we're trying to take from him. And what we take from him is souls that he currently has enslaved. See, recognize what Jesus did here when he was dealing with these folks at this party. He was helping them to recognize that anything we do for souls is far better than trying to hold on to any religious tradition and religious parents. And then I need you to see that clearly this week as we prepare to talk about the new. Because the challenge, beloved, listen to me. There was a study that was done. Baptist churches are closing like mad. And in the study, they found that the reason these Baptist churches are closing is because they don't want to change.
Yeah, that's true.
And so people get used to this oldness and they don't want to let it go. I'm telling you, listen, one of the things you have to think about is people change. That's why we went from a Nokia to an iPhone, because people change. And as people change, you have to have churches that are willing to change too, so that they can reach the generations beyond the original generation they started that church with. Listen to me. Some of you got saved on one thing, and you want to hold on to that thing all your life, but you have to recognize that there's a generation that comes behind you that cannot be reached by that same thing. And I need for you to be the kind of person who is like, all right, look, I recognize that I got saved on this, but I also recognize that if we want to save then we got to change it, and I'm going to be okay with changing it. You don't need to keep it the way that I had it when I got saved. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Amen.
Listen, we have an opportunity, beloved.
Amen.
In a church, oh, Jesus. I shared this with you, I think, several weeks ago. I've been told this by several men of God who I know. Many of them pastor churches of thousands of people. I've had them tell me, more than one person, these people don't even know each other. Pastor Ron, your church is where it is in its number because you're in Tampa.
Yeah. Yep.
They say your church is where it is in number because you're in Tampa. One pastor tried to get me to leave.
Wow.
One pastor was like, Ron, you know what? You need to be in Virginia. He was like, you need to be in Tennessee. He was like, you got to get out of Tampa.
Wow.
Tampa is the second least churched city in the country. Tampa falls behind Las Vegas. Oh, y'all didn't know. I do my homework because I pastored this joint. Listen. Tampa's the second least church city in the nation. This is hard ground. Yeah, one of the things that's difficult is there are a number of churches that are holding on to tradition. And there's a large number of those churches that are holding on tradition where the demographic looks a lot like this one.
Wow.
So that means that if we want to reach a new group of people in a city that's been holding on to tradition, we got to let tradition go.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, we are not a traditional church by any means, but there are other ways that we have to experience our newness here at Designer's Way. And I need you to be ready for it. I need your minds to be open to it. I need you to already be in a place where, as I begin to talk about where we're going and what we're doing and how we are going to make ourselves a church that when people show up to these doors, they're like, wow, look at that. I want people to come to our church and be like, I've never seen that done that way. Not by these folks.
That's right.
I want people to come and be like, wow, look at that. People to leave here and be like, man, what I experienced. The people that I experienced. See, Jesus had a wow factor. That's why he could say to a man, come follow me, and he would just shut his whole thing down and just, well, while I'm at it, while I'm throwing out my business, let me throw you a party too. Like, that's a wow factor.
That's right.
Do you know that because God is with us, because this is a church that God established, because God has sustained us, beloved, the average church ends within the first 5 years.
Right.
We're on 3 times going now. We're already in our 3rd cycle.
Amen.
God has sustained us. We've been through all kinds of ups and downs, and the Lord has still sustained us. It's because he has a work for us. Man, I'm so excited. I'm close to preaching next week's message, but I can't. All right. We're going to begin to talk about, over these next 4 weeks, some of the specific things that we're about to do that is going to radically transform our church. We are going to be a new church in 2020, but we're going to be a church for the 2020s. We're going to set a foundation and work in a way to where we can reach the generation behind the current generation so that the Lord can always do a work through us that transforms lives in this city. Bow your heads with me.
Designer.